Welcome to Jack Colley's Black Book. This is episode 33. And we start with something called kangaroo care. And kangaroo care, I teach this in my developmental psychology class. And well, actually, let me tell you about my developmental psychology class, at least in terms of the curriculum. So developmental psychology is looking at the psychology of different periods in the human experience. And so in my developmental psychology class on human development, there are 13 chapters. And at the beginning of the book, we look at the neonate, the newborn. And then before that, actually, we look at the prenate, the prenatal individual. And then the neonate, the newborn, and then it goes through childhood, adolescence, young adults, adulthood, and then all the way up to senior citizens. And then chapter 13 is on death and afterlife. So what's interesting about this particular course is that it's human development taught from the context or from the perspective of different cultures. And initially, when I was asked to teach this course, I thought, oh, well, we're going to be looking at Piaget and what Piaget thought about how children think and process their world. And we'll look at Maslow, and we'll look at all of these practitioners that have a lot to say about human development. Of course, there's a ton more, but all of them, at least that I was taught, for the most part, were from a Eurocentric perspective. And so when I got the textbook, when I was asked to teach this course, and I said yes, and then I got the textbook, and the textbook was Human Development from a Cross-Cultural Perspective. And so I started to plan what to teach, and I started with chapter 13 because I believe that our perspective on death and the afterlife often will inform how we live. So I always start by teaching chapter 13. So, these poor students, they get with me and it's like, okay, welcome to human development. We're going to start the first week or two of class. And we're going to talk about death. That's really exciting. But anyway, they find it interesting. But kangaroo care. So when you look at your neonates, your newborns, and when you look at your very small children, even pre-toddler children, there is this topic called kangaroo care. And it is when a mother straps the child to her front and actually carries the child around with her from day to day. And it's interesting because cultures that practice kangaroo care, they may have children that walk later in life, that crawl later. And so some of the gross motor movements might be a little bit delayed. And from a European perspective, where, we want our kids to be independent, and, we might look at that and we might say, oh my gosh, look at what those individuals are doing to their children. They're delaying their development, so on and so forth. And yet there are some real positives to kangaroo care, particularly if you are living in a society where you have to be prepared for more of a collective established community, and more of a collective culture where you actually have to interact with people, where you do care about each other, as your family, where it does take the proverbial village to raise the child, as opposed to often our Western approach of child rearing, which is very individualistic and very, I can do this on my own. I'm an island unto myself, and we value the individual that seems to be self-sufficient. And yet there are many cultures where that is not the norm. The norm is more of a collectivist culture where there's much more integration among the community. And I personally think that we're missing a lot of that in our Western culture, particularly in the United States. So the idea of kangaroo care, and that's just one example of how sometimes we can look at something and we can kind of pass these judgments. Oh, that's not appropriate to do it that way. And yet when we look at the big picture and we really get to know something, it's like, wow, that's really something that we ought to consider doing more of, perhaps. So during this particular class, I forget what developmental stage we were talking about, but I had a student who shared a story, and this is where I want to kind of launch off here. And he was telling a story about a village. He was living in Africa. And in this particular village that he was a part of, He was making the argument, I guess, that because of the way the village was run in terms of being communal, in terms of having more of a collective culture, because everybody knew each other, there was this idea given, this perception given that somehow things were self-correcting and there was no need for authority, there was no need for police, for military, that everything could be self-correcting. And I listened to him for quite some time because I want my students to share, even though they may be sharing something that is like, okay, where are we going with this? I want them to have the chance to share. But the idea was this, the idea was, such and such a culture doesn't have problems with stealing because you'll get your hand cut off. I'm sure people have heard that before. And as I thought about that and processed this, I thought, I'm not sure that I fully agree with that specific part of the mechanism where we're going to harm people to scare people into behaving appropriately. I don't really, that does not sit well with me, this idea that, well, your neighbor can just have your hand chopped off if you steal from them. But there was also this element of, but by the same token, if we really are paying attention, depending on how you feel human beings are wired, if we really are paying attention to, the angel and the devil on each of our soldiers' shoulders, whispering in our ear whether something is right or wrong, if we could really stay true to that, and if we really believe that that happens, then we really could have a society and a culture and different populations that care for each other. And because everybody does the right thing, taking care of themselves and taking care of others, the idea is that there would be no violence, there would be no stealing, there would be no lying, there would be no cheating, et cetera, et cetera. However, let's live in reality here at the same time. This was probably a young man in his early 20s, and he had a lot more life experience than most people, having come from Africa to the United States. And yet at the same time, there was this part of me that was just kind of like, okay, we'll see what you think about that in 20 years, 10 years even, once you've had the experience of seeing how horrendous, some human beings can treat other human beings. Here's the thing I want to leave. Regardless of your belief about what motivates us and what might turn us into good people or bad people or whatever, I think it's important to speak up. And here's where I want to, unpack just a couple of things. Speaking up, in my mind, does wonders for the person who's speaking up, the people who are observing. It even does wonders for individuals who are being assaulted, accosted, oppressed, put down. It is very important to speak up. And here's just a couple thoughts on speaking up. Number one, bystanders. A lot of research, psychological research, has been done on bystanders. In other words, people who witness something happening that is not right, witness the abuse of somebody, witnessing, like at a school, the bullying of somebody. The importance of speaking up and actually saying something cannot be understated, or cannot be overstated. I guess I don't know which one that would be. But anyway, it's important to speak up in situations like that. From the person who speaks up, I believe that if you speak up, you will feel much better about your choice to speak up than you will your choice not to speak up. And so part of this, I want to encourage people to consider that when you see something being said, if you see somebody being abused, somebody being verbally assaulted, somebody having different racial slurs applied to them, it is important that you speak up and you say, you know what, that's not appropriate. We can't do that. We're not going to do that here, in saying something like that. So it does a lot of good for you to see that you have that power to protect the victim. The other thing it does is it inspires people around you. So again, the idea of the bystander effect, the idea of diffusion of responsibility. When there is a group of people and the responsibility has been diffused, here's the example I can give you. You're traveling down the road in a pack of 30 cars and you see somebody has rolled over in the ditch and nobody has stopped. But it looks like the accident already happened, or it happened recently. And what you do is you continue to drive by because what you say to yourself is, well, everybody has a cell phone. I'll let somebody else, somebody else is going to call it in, because I have to get to my next whatever. That is the diffusion of responsibility. That is kind of not being a bystander, but being a witness and just not really doing anything, not speaking up, not actually doing something about the situation. We know that if there's a group of individuals watching a crime occur, watching somebody being assaulted, we know that there is strength in numbers. And we know that if one person speaks up, it is much more likely that another person will speak up. And at some point, perhaps we can actually affect the collective nature of the populations of which we're a part, so that that becomes the expectation. That becomes the rule instead of the exception, where when something happens, people in the vicinity speak up, multiple people, because it is an expectation. It is no longer the expectation that somebody else is going to take care of it. Also, the other thing I want to share is this. I think it does good for the person who is actually the aggressor. So I think this is an important thing to look at as well, is if groups of people speak up, if groups of people stand up for the victim and support the victim and have the victim's back and are there for the victim, it is the aggressor that is ultimately going to also get the message that the behavior is not appropriate. It is not appropriate to be an aggressor. And that is something too, where by speaking up and kind of establishing the norms that these behaviors are not going to be acceptable. So it is very important to speak up. Now, the only thing that I can think of that is maybe an exception to this rule, and I don't, I'm not going to take the time to kind of process this right now, but there are situations where shooters go into schools and they specifically target very vulnerable populations. That is a level of mental disorder on a level that is really difficult for me to wrap my mind around. So to what extent we speak up in situations like that versus just take care of the problem, I'm really not sure. I guess I'm not ready to comment on that, other than to acknowledge, yes, there are situations where perhaps, some of the things I'm talking about are just not realistic. But anyway, I hope that at least maybe gets a little bit of a dialogue going about what you can do in situations where you see individuals being hurt or individuals being oppressed, the importance of saying something. All right. Namaste, my friends.